Slava Isusu Christou, glory to Jesus Christ. This is Father Jack Custer at St. Michael's Cathedral in Passaic, New Jersey, back with another installment of our most recent adult faith formation series on Catholic social teaching. We're working our way slowly through the literature, and we're currently looking at the encyclical letter of Pope Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, written on the 40th anniversary of the promulgation of Pope Leo XIII's groundbreaking encyclical Rerum Novarum. Tonight I want to look at Pope Pius's discussion of private property. And I want to preface it with a warning. Because of the history of Catholicism in the United States, because of the fact that pretty much all Catholics who are not converts have always been viewed as more recent arrivals, and Catholicism has always come with the baggage of immigration, there's always been real pressure on Catholics to conform to what they perceive to be mainstream American culture. And since most of our immediate ancestors, my grandparents, probably yours if you're my age, or your great-grandparents, or maybe a newer wave of immigration, since immigrants have tended to be attracted here at least partially because of the economic opportunities the United States provided dramatically in the early days of industrialization, late 19th and early 20th centuries, right through the 1950s. It's a different story today in some ways. Because of the economic opportunity that attracted people to the United States, they were very, very willing, enthusiastic even, to buy into the whole package of American economics, if you will, and to buy into it uncritically. So I was raised, and probably you were raised, to believe that American and Catholic, they can never conflict. Now, issues like abortion have been proving since the 70s that that's not the case. And many Catholics have come around on that issue and have begun to see themselves as standing in opposition to mainstream American culture. It's been a harder sell when it comes to issues like warfare and economics. And as a result, in the United States, Catholic education, I think, has really downplayed the full breadth of the social teaching of the universal church since the turn of the 20th century. Because some of what you're going to hear tonight may sound, from an American perspective, to be kind of lefty. Not the sort of thing we're used to hearing from the pulpit. Not the way you and I have been taught to hear the gospel. Let's give Pope Pius a hearing. Please remember that Pope Leo XIII, in Rerum Novarum in 1891, had already made it perfectly clear against the claims of socialism that private property is a fundamental human right. The human person has the right to acquire and use and keep so as to provide for his or her family the goods necessary to conduct a decent life. A farmer, a tradesperson, needs to have certain tools in order to pursue their trades. All of us need a roof over our heads and a stable source of food. Now, Pope Leo probably still imagined a world in which private property meant the land farmers worked on and the tools they used to work them, and the kind of savings in cash and in crop and in seed that they kept from year to year to year. Private property would have included a couple of farm animals, maybe, or a couple of domestic animals. And in the cities, private property would have meant the premises and the tools with which tradespeople plied their trades. Writing 40 years later, Pope Pius XI sees the world largely the way you and I would see it today. We'll see a few new expressions in Pope Pius that Leo never used. So Pius, first of all, reaffirms what Leo taught and reminds us that the teaching, in the Latin tradition at least, is clearly set out by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, that the individual person has a right to private property. How do you get private property? Private property is acquired by occupying, say, a house or a piece of land, something not owned by anyone else already. Private property is also acquired by labor. It's not just that I set up in this field and say, this one's mine now, but by investing myself in tilling and planting and cultivating and harvesting, I have invested hours and hours and hours of work and creativity into this piece of ground, and I therefore have a right to its fruit. Pope Pius goes on to say that only the labor which a person performs in his own name, and by virtue of which a new form or an increase of a thing grants him title, gives him the right to claim something as private property. So, I've already used the example of a field. Think of a blacksmith who takes pieces of formless iron and shapes them into usable forms by hours and hours of hard labor, employing some sort of furnace or minimal tools like an anvil and a hammer and a fire and some bellows. This personal investment is what gives him the right to claim this horseshoe, this anchor, as private property that he can now sell to somebody else. Pope Leo and Pope Pius also remind us that the original cause of any property and of any prosperity from property is God. It's God who first generously bestowed natural riches and resources. Then come the few who invent the tools, clear the land, create the industry, thereby enabling the employment of more and more people. And it's interesting, the book of Genesis can actually trace many of these steps. It's only a few generations after Adam and Eve that we have men who are credited with the establishment of certain crafts, working in metal, making music, farming, herding. So even in the 10th century BC, the scriptures were already seeing the steps in economic development. Pope Leo had already insisted that capital, the few who build industries, and labor, the many who work in them, need each other. And Leo says this as a way of responding to the claims of socialism that capitalists only exploit and can only exploit the labor of the people they employ. Pope Pius, following again Pope Leo XIII, takes us on a little historical tour and reminds us that private property has been experienced in different ways over the course of history. He quotes Rerum Novarum, number 14, where Pope Leo had said, God has left the limits of private possessions to be fixed by the industry of men and institutions of people. Let's take that in two steps. In different times and different places, there are those who are, by God's grace, more skilled and so are able to produce more, or to invent something, or to find a better way of doing a task that's already been done for years. In different ages, there are always those who work harder and those who slack off. And ever since the dawn of history, ever since at least chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, people have been forming something like states. And these states, which are the creation of human beings who choose to come together for the common good, these states then enact laws by common agreement, which will establish rights and limit rights, among those rights being private property. For example, in colonial America, there was the village green, which was the property of the community and and could not be the property of any individual. During the time of expansion in the United States, the federal government would give parcels of land in Western territories that kept moving further and further west to people willing to settle them. In medieval times, a lord who by conquest had become the ruler of a certain piece of territory might give as a reward to his nobles various pieces of this territory, which they would then get others to work to provide them with income. And in the mid to late 19th century, suddenly industrialization is creating a whole new way whereby property is used, labor is invited, and labor itself can produce a new kind of prosperity for laborers, and therefore the possibility of more private property, even for laborers. But both Leo and Pius insist that there are limits to the powers of the state as well. The individual is prior to the state. God created Adam and Eve. He didn't create a state. The family is prior to the state. God created Adam and Eve and commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. He didn't tell them to become the state of Israel. The formation of states comes much later in the history of humanity and in the history of salvation as recorded in the scriptures. Pope Pius says, the natural right of owning goods privately and of passing them on by inheritance ought always to remain intact. Notice those two things. It's not just that I amass goods for myself. There's a family value here right from the start. I have a right to provide for my family while I'm alive, and also to help ensure their survival after my death. The right to possess private property and to pass it on by inheritance are both facts of natural law. Pius continues, it is grossly unjust for a state to exhaust private wealth through the weight of taxes. There is a limit, again imposed by natural law, to how much a state can tax an individual. Here, obviously, as the popes keep insisting, it's not their job to write economic policy. They're not going to say how much tax is legitimate, 15%, 20%, and beyond which point tax becomes illegitimate. They're simply stating the overriding moral law that any economic policy needs to follow in order to do God's will. In Rerum Novarum, Leo had said, the state can only control the exercise of private property and bring it into conformity with the common good. Control the exercise of private property. What does that mean? When you think about economic policy, that means taxes. And interestingly, the Holy Father goes on to say, when the state brings private ownership into harmony with the needs of the common good, it does not commit a hostile act against private owners, but rather does them a friendly service, for it thereby effectively prevents the private possession of goods, which the author of nature ordained for the support of human life, from causing intolerable evils and thus rushing to its own destruction. What does this complicated language mean? It means this, that when the state, through taxation or through regulation of things like interest, puts limits on the possession of private property, it prevents a greater evil. Both Leo and Pius are thinking of the various upheavals, protests, revolutions that have been occurring since 1848 as people who are dispossessed and permanently poor and totally marginalized from any possible improvement in their economic situation, whether through slavery or serfdom, whether through manipulative wage labor in environments that are unsafe and so controlled that the laborer remains the pawn of his employer. Sooner or later, the balance tips and people will react to the obvious injustice of a few having so much and the many not having the little they need to survive. In the 20th century, that took the form of all sorts of socialist agitation. It led to the Russian Revolution. It led to economic chaos in Germany after the First World War, which led to a rise in both socialism and communism in Germany, which led to the counter-reaction leading to the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler. This injustice, which eventually will seek redress through violence, if no other means are available, this injustice, Leo and Pius say, can be rectified by the state by setting limits to just how much private property an individual can possess when so many others are without the basics that they need. And so things in our own experience, like sales tax, taxes on gasoline, real estate taxes, that's a tough word to say in New Jersey, or inheritance taxes, focus on those who have the money to go shopping, have the money to own a car and take it around, have the money to buy real estate, have the money to leave to their descendants. Target, therefore, those who have, and take some, ideally, we hope, to invest in programs that will benefit the lot of the many who have so much less. Sin taxes are another way governments do this sort of thing, by taxing obvious luxuries like alcohol and tobacco. They provide income for funding programs that will relieve the needs of those who do not have enough to survive. So, private property is a right, but its rights are limited by the common good. That much Pope Pius says, quoting Pope Leo XIII. But now Pius goes further. He says, private property has two dimensions. One individual and one social. If we exaggerate either one of these dimensions, we're on a course that can only lead to injustice. If we exaggerate the social dimension of private property, we will reason our way to a socialism that says everything in the world, everything in this state belongs to everyone altogether. Nice. Who's going to parcel it out? A centralized, absolute, totalitarian state. Here, Pope Pius is again pointing at socialism, which he calls here collectivism, and says it minimizes the individual character of private property, the natural right of an individual to acquire by occupancy and by labor the things he or she needs for a decent life, and the right to pass on what is produced and saved by their own providence to their descendants. What about exaggerating the individual character of private property? I earned it. I can spend my money any way I want. Think of the gospel parable of the fool who had a good harvest. And he scratches his head and says, what am I going to do about this? All my grain won't fit in my barns. I know. I'll build larger barns. Then all of my goods and all of my grain can go there, and I can just kick back and relax and eat and drink and be merry, and I'm good to go forever. It's my grain. I produced it. I can do whatever I want with it. That's exaggerated individualism. And it is mocked and condemned by no one less than our Lord Jesus Christ. Pope Pius calls these the two rocks of shipwreck between which any healthy economic policy has to steer. On the one hand, it is wrong to say that nobody has a right to own anything. The state owns everything on behalf of everyone. History has shown us where that goes. it is also wrong to say, I have absolute and exclusive right over everything I produce and earn and own to do whatever I want with. Pius says, the right to possess property is one thing. The way it is used is another. Pius says the state has a right to govern in a broad way the use of private property, which it does by taxation and by other economic laws that limit things like interest. But Pius also notes that there are virtues and obligations which no human law, no economic system can enforce, which are nonetheless binding upon Christians. Here, Pius points at what he calls superfluous income. What's that? Quote, income which a person does not need to sustain life fittingly and with dignity is not left entirely to his own free determination. Rather, sacred scripture and the fathers of the church constantly declare in the most explicit language that the rich are bound by a very grave precept to practice almsgiving, beneficence, and munificence. Okay, almsgiving we know. Somebody's begging on the street, you hand them money. Beneficence is, I guess, a little more general. It's where you in various ways reach out and share what you have with others. Munificence is when you actually build structures, institutions through which the surplus goods that you have can be shared with others. So it's beneficence when I clean out my closets and take a big garbage bag full of clothing to the Salvation Army. It is munificence when a parish decides, for example, just for example, to establish a food pantry and to maintain it. We've now built a structure, an institution. Now, in the good old days, munificence was something kings and lords and dukes and ducklings did. In a secular capitalist society, it lies well within the reach of middle-class people like ourselves, like St. Michael's Parish, to come together and organize a structure which supports others. Superfluous income. Friends, we live in a consumer culture. We live in a culture where shopping is entertainment. We live in a culture in which an entire marketing industry exists to talk us into buying things we don't need. Probably within 5 miles of where you are right now, there is a storage facility which exists to sell people space in which to store the goods that won't fit in their homes. We probably have closets that are overflowing with clothes we no longer fit in or haven't worn in years. We may well shop in big box stores where we are buying by the case, rather than by the item. We go shopping for entertainment, and we buy things to make ourselves feel good. That's superfluous income. There are whole channels on TV dedicated to nothing more than making us shop. Ever since the creation of internet retail, things like Amazon, we have a whole new outlet for buying things we don't need. We earn that money. We can do whatever we want with it, right? That's not what Pope Pius teaches. It's not what St. John Chrysostom, whose feast we keep today, teaches when he says, if you have been given wealth by God, he's given it to you so that you can practice charity with the poor. St. Basil the Great says, if you've got 2 coats in your closet, one of them belongs to the poor man who has none. It's my money. I earned it. I can do whatever I want with it. Just to let ourselves off the hook for a minute, Pius, whose father was an industrialist who ran a textile factory, Pius says another way of using private property for the common good is when industrialists or capitalists expend more money to create jobs for more people. Oh, I can reduce my profit margin in order to keep more people employed. Isn't this exactly the opposite of how corporate America works? If you've had a job in the last 10 years, you've probably seen the workforce around you decrease so that you're now doing the work formerly done by more people than yourself. That's certainly true here at St. Michael's Rectory. Companies tend to downsize these days. Companies are tempted to kick out senior employees in their 50s and 60s so as to hire new laborers who will work for much less money. Pius points the finger at the people who run the economic system. You make less money, but create more jobs. In our own time, Pope John Paul II, whom we remember as a valiant opponent of communism, also had some harsh things to say about the excesses of capitalism. Pope Francis has made not very many friends in certain circles in the United States by seeming to continue those critiques against the excesses of capitalism. As near as I can tell, Pope Pius XI is the first person to use the word capital. That is to say, not private property, not the tools I work with, not the land I work on, but the cash I hold in investments. He's the first person to use capital in an encyclical. He says in number 54, property, that is capital, and now he uses the word, has undoubtedly long been able to appropriate too much to itself. Whatever was produced, whatever returns accrued, capital claimed for itself, hardly leaving to the worker enough to restore and renew his strength. For the doctrine was preached that all accumulation of capital falls by an absolutely insuperable economic law to the rich, and that by the same law the workers are given over and bound to perpetual want to the scantiest of livelihoods. It is true indeed that things have not always and everywhere corresponded to this sort of teaching of the so-called Manchesterian liberals. He's quoting a school of economics in England of the 1920s. Yet it cannot be denied that economic social institutions have moved steadily in that direction. That these false ideas, these erroneous suppositions have been vigorously assailed, and not by those alone who through them were being deprived of their innate right to obtain better conditions, will surprise no one. Pius is saying, to some degree, the social unrest, the labor agitation, the rioting, the rise and popularity of socialism, even in these years in the United States, let us remember, didn't come from nowhere. It was fueled out of a sense of real injustice. And so even if the principles of socialism are wrong, and they are, Pius says you can understand why simple laborers would be attracted to it, because it speaks to an injustice they see and they feel in their very bellies. Capital has long been able to appropriate too much to itself. Think about an industry. Let's think about the pharmaceutical industry. Just for an example. I know nothing about it really. Maybe you have stocks in a particular pharmaceutical company. Maybe you're invested in a mutual fund, and some of your investments, those that are not in cash or in bonds, are in pharmaceuticals. When the pharmaceuticals do well, you and I, who are investors, we're capitalists, we're investors, we get a dividend. We share in the profit when our companies do well. How often is that profit also shared with the employers who are actually running the machines, making the little pills and stuffing them in the little bottles and putting the bottles in the boxes and sending the boxes off to the warehouses and from the warehouses to the pharmacies? Profit sharing is a word I first heard in the late 70s. There are companies that do it for their executives, for their managers. How many companies are actually sharing their profits percentually with all their employees? I'm sure McDonald's is making a lot more money these days. Is the person actually dishing out the fries, sharing in the profits? Does that person see a percentual increase because the corporation has shown a greater profit by this same percent? Not usually. Not then, not now. In number 55, Pius says, okay, this is exactly, socialists have seized on this fact that we've created for ourselves, this injustice that we have created for ourselves. Socialists seize on this to their own advantage and argue, see, private property doesn't work. You need a state that's going to control everything and is going to give everyone their fair share. Some of you have survived Soviet socialist Slovakia. or Ukraine. Our food pantry is serving people escaping the socialism of Venezuela. We know it doesn't work, but you can see why the thought might be appealing. And so, in number 57, Pope Pius condemns both absolute individualism and absolute collectivism. Then he does something very interesting, and I'll end here. He quotes this famous passage from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, where St. Paul, seems to preach a very, very clear line. He who does not work should not eat. In context, Paul is looking at a small church community in Thessalonica, in northern Greece. And he says, I hear some of you people up there in the community are being busybodies. You're getting into everybody's business when you should be contributing something. The churches certainly took it upon themselves to support each other in their needs, especially widows, orphans, the elderly. He who does not work should not eat. Pius says, the apostle is passing judgment on those who are unwilling to work, although they can and ought to, and he admonishes us that we ought diligently to use our time and energies of body and mind and not be a burden to others when we can provide for ourselves. But here's the line, but the apostle in no wise teaches that labor is the sole title to a living or an income. There are lots of circumstances that can prevent a person for a longer or shorter period of time from engaging in gainful employment. Here, Pius, without fleshing out his thought completely, is forbidding you and me to simply use the simple one line, let them earn it for themselves, as the excuse that prevents you and me from doing charity, that prevents you and me from sharing what we have. I earned it, so can they. These simple one-liners are not sufficient answer to the imbalance that's always existed between the few who have and the many who don't have. And in every age of the church is taught that the few who have an obligation, by the very fact that they have, to share what they have with those who are in need, because it is God who has allowed this situation of imbalance to exist so that both the few and the many can grow in virtue and can come together in a relationship bound by charity. And so, Pius's conclusion, number 58, to each, therefore, must be given his own share of goods, and the distribution of created goods, which, as every person knows, is laboring today under the gravest evils due to the disparity between the few exceedingly rich and the unnumbered propertyless, must be effectively called back to and brought into conformity with the norms of the common good, that is, social justice. Pius is writing at a time when Europe is in a mess, still putting itself together from the First World War, being ripped apart by this social agitation, being upended by migrations of people, migration from the country to the city, by emigration out of Europe entirely to the New World. In the United States, we're living in the Gilded Age. Think of The Great Gatsby, where a few people have made a lot of money, not just in industry anymore, but now also just in banking, just in investment, just in finance. Money is now making money. We know how that's going to crash in 1929. But in this age where disparity was very, very obvious for different reasons in different places, Pius said, socialism is the proof that things are wrong. Socialism isn't the solution to the problem, but it's the glaring proof that something's wrong. And the gospel tells us how to fix it. In our own day, when we talk so commonly about the 1%, when we see a wealthy class growing wealthier, a poorer class growing poorer, and a middle class whose quality of life has been decreasing for a number of years, a middle class who, for the first time, may not have reason to believe that their children will be better off economically than they were themselves. I was a teacher for too long. Those disparities are still with us, even if our closets are full of clothes we never wear. Slava Isusu Christu.